1 Samuel chapter 18. And it comes to pass, when he finishes to speak to Saul, that the soul of Jonathan has been bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loves him as his own soul. And Saul takes him on that day, and has not permitted him to return to the house of his father. And Jonathan makes David also a covenant, because he loves him as his own soul. And Jonathan strips himself of the upper robe which is on him, and gives it to David, and his long robe, even to his sword, and to his bow, and to his girdle. And David goes out wherever Saul sends him. He acts wisely. And Saul sets him over the men of war. And it is good in the eyes of the people, and also in the eyes of the servants of Saul. And it comes to pass in their coming in, and David's returning from striking the Philistine, that the women come out from all the cities of Israel to sing, also the dancers, to meet Saul the king, with tambourines, with joy, and with 3-stringed instruments. And the women answer those playing and say, Saul has struck among his thousands, and David among his myriads. And it is exceedingly displeasing to Saul, and this thing is evil in his eyes, and he says, They have given myriads to David, and they have given the thousands to me. And what more is there for him but the kingdom? And Saul is eyeing David from that day and from then on. And it comes to pass on the next day that the spirit of sadness from God prospers over Saul, and he prophesies in the midst of the house, and David is playing with his hand as he did day by day, and the javelin is in the hand of Saul. And Saul casts the javelin and says, I strike through David, even through the wall. And David turns around out of his presence twice. And Saul is afraid of the presence of David, for Yahweh has been with him, and he has turned aside from Saul. And Saul turns him aside from him, and appoints him to himself for the head of 1,000. And he goes out and comes in before the people. And David is acting wisely in all his ways, and Yahweh is with him. And Saul sees that he is acting very wisely, and is afraid of him. And all Israel and Judah love David when he is going out and coming in before them. And Saul says to David, Behold, my elder daughter Merab, I give her to you for a wife. Only be for a son of valor to me, and fight the battles of Yahweh. And Saul said, Do not let my hand be on him, but let the hand of the Philistines be on him. And David says to Saul, Who am I, and what is my life, the family of my father in Israel, that I am son-in-law of the king? And it comes to pass at the time of the giving of Merab, daughter of Saul, to David, that she has been given to Adriel the Meholathite for a wife. And Michal, daughter of Saul, loves David, and they declare it to Saul, and the thing is right in his eyes. And Saul says, I give her to him, and she is for him a snare to him, and the hand of the Philistines is on him. And Saul says to David, By the second you become my son-in-law today. And Saul commands his servants, Speak to David greatly, saying, Behold, the king has delighted in you. And Saul says to David, By the second you become my son-in-law today. And Saul commands his servants, Speak to David gently, saying, Behold, the king has delighted in you, and all his servants have loved you, and now be son-in-law of the king. And the servants of Saul speak these words in the ears of David, and David says, Is it a light thing in your eyes to be son-in-law of the king? And I am a poor man, and lightly esteemed. And the servants of Saul declare it to him, saying, David has spoken according to these words. And Saul says, Thus you say to David, There is no delight for the king in dowry, but in 100 foreskins of the Philistines, to be avenged on the enemies of the king. And Saul thought to cause David to fall by the hand of the Philistines. And his servants declare these words to David, and the thing is right in the eyes of David, to be son-in-law of the king. And the days have not been full, and David rises and goes, he and his men, and David strikes 200 men among the Philistines. And David brings in their foreskins, and they set them before the king, to be son-in-law of the king. And Saul gives his daughter Michal to him for a wife. And Saul sees and knows that Yahweh is with David, and Michal, daughter of Saul, has loved him. And Saul adds to be afraid of the presence of David still, and Saul is an enemy of David for all the days. And the princes of the Philistines come out, and it comes to pass, from the time of their coming out, David has acted more wisely than any of the servants of Saul, and his name is very precious.